am a man who views life simply. Right is right, wrong is wrong. Things are not as complicated as we make them out to be. Many people see gray areas in life, but I tend to see things in black and white. That's why I found it so very difficult to forgive myself for what I did. I know I'm here to tell you about the cross. And I will. But I need to share with you some events that preceded the cross, like the remembrance meal we shared. It was different from any I'd ever had before. While we were eating and drinking, Jesus kept talking about his body and his blood. We didn't really understand, but we followed his lead. That was nothing new. To be honest, most of us who followed Jesus didn't understand a third of what he said. Either it was over our heads or we were too busy arguing about things that didn't really matter to catch the words of our teacher. That night we were definitely paying attention. We just didn't understand. But we ate the bread and drank the wine and went on with the evening. Following supper, Jesus asked us to go with him to the garden. And that was nothing new either. Jesus liked to pray in the garden, and we liked to listen to him pray. His prayers to God were so different than any we'd ever heard before. I remember him praying for us one time. Instead of a peasant speaking to a king, it was like a child asking his father to do things for him. I loved his prayers. This night was different. Instead of us all praying together, Jesus said to most of us, "Stay here while I go further into the garden and pray." We began to sit down, but Jesus motioned to Peter, James, and me to follow him a little further into the garden. So we did. Jesus stopped, turned, and said to us, "My soul is overwhelmed to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." And then he left and went further into the garden. Peter looked at me and said, "John, what is he talking about?" I assured him that I didn't know, that we should pray. We all agreed, and we began to pray silently. Our first mistake was praying silently. Our second was lying down after a meal. I don't know when Peter and James dripped it off, but I barely got "Dear Heavenly Father" out of my mouth before I fell asleep. I was awakened by Jesus' voice. "Couldn't you stay watch with me for 1 hour?" I looked down in shame as he asked us again to stay watch with him. We all tried. But before I knew it, I was asleep again. I found out later that Jesus came back a second time, only to find us asleep. And in silence, he went back to pray. Jesus returned a third time to where we were, and it was then that he woke us up and told us, "The hour is near. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners." Then things took a turn for the worst. Judas showed up with a large crowd of people with swords and clubs. He walked right up to Jesus, saying something like, "Greetings, Rabbi." and he kissed Jesus on the cheek. He betrayed Jesus with a kiss of friendship. That traitor! Well, and then Peter, he grabbed a sword and he cut a guard's ear off. Jesus stopped Peter and told him to put up the sword. And Jesus reached down, picked up the ear, and miraculously placed it right back on his head. We were hysterical after that. James took off one way, Peter another, and I'd like to tell you that I stayed to defend my Lord, my teacher, my friend. But I didn't. I got scared, and I ran away and I hid, just like the others. In his moment of need, I left him. We all left him alone. As I understand it, they took Jesus through a series of trials throughout the evening, making a mockery of justice. They had tried and convicted him before he ever set foot in front of the religious leaders. But because Jewish law could not quench their thirst for blood, they took Jesus to the Romans. Governor Pilate wanted nothing to do with Jesus, and he tried to pawn him off on Herod. Herod saw Jesus as some sort of magician. But when Jesus refused to speak, much less perform for Herod, he was mocked and sent back to Pilate to be dealt with. The religious leaders had decided they needed blood. And with the crowd behind them, Pilate wasn't about to disappoint. So Pilate sentenced Jesus to death and washed his hands of the entire affair. I don't remember who it was that came and told me. When I found out they were going to kill Jesus, I realized just how cowardly I had been. If I had known this was going to happen, I would have stayed awake and prayed. If I had known, things would have been different. This was the way things were. And I was powerless to stop it from happening. I found Jesus' mother, Mary, and I told her what I knew. And then I went with her and a few other women to the place of the skull. By the time we got there, they had already stripped him and were about to nail him to the cross. At first, I didn't believe it was him. He was unrecognizable. His face so swollen from beating after beating. Later, when I heard his voice, I knew for certain that it was my friend. How could this be? Just hours earlier, we were eating together, and now this was happening. One of the guards approached Jesus and knelt down, holding a spike to his wrist. The guard then raised his arm and with a strong swing, tore through Jesus' flesh into the wood beneath. Jesus screamed in anguish and pain. Mary fell to the ground, weeping uncontrollably.
The cold soldier continued hammering until the nail was securely in the cross. And then he stepped over Jesus' body and proceeded to drive a second nail through his other wrist. I could not bear the sound of my friend screaming out in pain, so I bowed my head and I covered my ears. But it was to no avail. A second soldier knelt down by Jesus' feet. He crossed Jesus' ankles and with the precision of a surgeon, drove a nail through both feet into the wood of the cross. Then with an intricate set of ropes and pulleys, the soldiers raised up the cross. Jesus on it. As the cross slipped into its hole in the earth, you could hear it hit the bottom of the hole with a thud. The sound of Jesus' flesh tearing as the weight of his body shifted from the wood of the cross to the spikes that held him there. I sat and watched my friend writhe in pain and wonder why a man so pure, so innocent, should suffer in this degrading and painful way. And the people, the crowds, the soldiers, the leaders mocking Jesus, making fun of him in most disrespectful ways. People walking by shouting, "He saved others! Why can't he save himself?" The soldiers casting lots for his garments. The leaders hurling insults at him. "You who were going to tear down and rebuild the temple, look at you now." I was so angry with all of them. Who were they to be at the foot of the cross where my friend hung? Who were they to stand there so smug? They who had turned their backs on God and his servant. Before I could say a word, Jesus spoke. His voice was raspy, tired, and weak. The same voice that had called forth the dead and calmed the sea. The voice that years earlier had said to me, "Follow me, and I will make you a fisher of men," now spoke again. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Forgive them? Forgive them? What was he thinking? They were killing him, and he pleaded for their forgiveness? Judgment was called for. Swift and sure judgment. They had forsaken God's chosen one, and they deserved the very punishment Jesus was receiving for nothing. How does an innocent man hang on a cross dying and call out for these guilty people to be forgiven? I wanted to shout at the top of my lungs, telling them that they were so wrong and that they would pay for their actions. Before I could say a word, Jesus spoke again. This time to Mary. Woman, here is your son. He was speaking of me. I looked in disbelief at his disfigured face. And his eyes met mine. And he spoke to me. Here is your mother. Jesus had asked me to take care of his mother. At that moment, I realized I was no better than any of the people standing at the foot of the cross that day. I had turned my back on God's servant just hours earlier in the garden. And yet, instead of chastising me for my lack of loyalty, he showed me his forgiveness by giving me the responsibility of taking care of his mother. What can I say in return? I was ready to cry out to him how sorry I was. But before I could say a word, he spoke. He took a deep breath. And in an almost triumphant, hoarse voice, cried out, "It is finished!" And then he bowed his head. And he gave up his spirit. Before I could apologize, before I could explain things to him, he was dead. And he was dead because of me.